So it's, Good Friday, Easter time, and I thought I'd tackle another biblical film that I actually kind of like, even though it's not the easiest thing to watch. The Passion of the Christ. Where do I start with this movie? Well, The Passion of the Christ came out in 2004. It was directed, produced, and partially written by Mel Gibson, and it chronicles the last 12 hours of Jesus' life before he got crucified on the cross. And I guess I'll just get this out of the way real quick. Mel Gibson, is he anti-Semitic? Yeah, probably, most likely. I wouldn't put it past him. He's said some pretty anti-Semitic things in the past, and we have it on record. So while I'm not going to be defending Mel Gibson as a person or his views against Jewish people, I am going to say right out the gate, I don't think The Passion of the Christ is an anti-Semitic film. I just watched it again and I don't really see anything that offensive towards Jewish people that isn't just inherent in the story, and even that, I think this movie actually paints the Romans in a worse light than the Jewish high priests, because the Romans are just kind of depicted as all drunks and sadists that just enjoy beating people. Whereas the Jewish Sanhedrin, well, they definitely want Jesus dead. Jesus really kind of shook up their deal and are saying things that they think of as blasphemous. And according to their religion, that's kind of what they have to do. And I think ultimately the purpose of this movie, and really what I think Mel Gibson was trying to get across in making this movie, is not to just pass the blame of Jesus' death to the Jews or the Romans or really anybody in particular. I think ultimately he's trying to get across that we all sin and we all made it necessary through our sin for Jesus to go through all this terrible torture and death. And as a Christian, I agree with that. I think as a human race, we are all culpable in making it necessary for Jesus to die on the cross. That's the reason he did it, after all. It wasn't just for one group of people, it was for all the people, so really all of us are responsible. And from here on out, that is the lens of which I'm going to be viewing this movie through, and whether or not this movie actually does a good job of getting that message across. I think it does more than it doesn't, but well, let's talk about it. So this movie is quite different from a lot of other Jesus movies you might have seen or you might have heard about because, well, for one, it's not the entire story of Jesus. It's only those last 12 hours from Gethsemane to the cross. And I guess you could also count him coming off the cross and him getting buried and resurrecting, although that all takes place over the span of maybe 5 minutes. But really the bulk of this movie is from Gethsemane, his arrest, his beating, his crucifixion, and that's pretty much it. It's a very kind of streamlined, stripped down, focused approach to the life of Jesus, which is actually kind of refreshing because I've seen a lot of movies try to encapsulate everything that Jesus did throughout his life and his ministry. It just doesn't really work all that well in one feature film. Either you get the greatest story ever told, which is 3+ hours long. Even then, I just kind of feel like you're going by the numbers. There's not a whole lot of really emotional investment there. Or you get the Son of God movie that just really condenses everything and leaves a lot out, and it also doesn't really do this story justice. So I do credit Mel Gibson for taking a focused look at the life of Jesus and not just trying to do everything. But another thing that sets this movie apart is it's actually not in English. For the sake of historical accuracy, Mel Gibson had all the actors speak in Aramaic, Hebrew, or Latin, depending on who they were and what position they held. And while I do appreciate that from an immersion perspective, and while you're watching it, if you're not paying super close attention to what language everyone's speaking, it does generally give you the feeling of being in first century Galilee. I do think that it technically doesn't quite work from an accuracy standpoint, because there is one major language that is just kind of left out in this movie, and it's Greek. And nobody really speaks Greek here, and even on the sign that is above Jesus' head is written in Latin and Hebrew, but it doesn't have the Greek. I'm thinking, where's the Greek? I just feel like that's one big kind of glaring issue when it comes to language that just kind of got left out here. Like I said before, this movie opens up right after the Last Supper at the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus is praying there and he's sweating the blood, and it's actually the only time when I've actually seen him sweat blood in a kind of realistic way, where it's just kind of this cold sweat beads all over his face, and I'm like, okay, accurate, kind of gross, but it would have been gross. And Jesus in this movie is played by Jim Caviezel, and Jim Caviezel does a good job in this movie. He really embodies the persona of Jesus. You don't really see Jim Caviezel, the actor, so much in this movie, and that's partially because of all the hair and makeup and prosthetics that he's got in his face, his eyes swollen shut throughout the vast majority of this movie. And on top of that, they even digitally altered his eyes, because Jim Caviezel in real life has blue eyes, and Obviously, Jesus would not have had blue eyes, no matter how many different blue-eyed Jesus portrayals we've gotten in the past. He was very much a Middle Eastern Jew, and he would definitely have brown eyes, so they digitally gave him brown eyes. And while I appreciate them taking the extra step and correcting this, the CGI eyes look kind of weird. They almost look reddish or like orange-ish. They kind of look like those vegetarian Twilight vampire eyes. They don't look quite human or quite real. And maybe that's the point. Maybe Jesus is supposed to have these kind of godlike eyes that are just captivating because that's his deity. But I don't know, for me it just kind of reads as more distracting than intentionally ethereal. And it's here in Gethsemane where we get a scene that is kind of in the Bible, but kind of not. We see Jesus praying in Gethsemane, and we see Satan, and Satan is portrayed as this kind of androgynous, bald, weird person. And I guess Mel Gibson's reasoning for Satan was that he wasn't this evil, pitchfork-wielding demon. He was actually kind of beautiful. He used to be an angel, so he wanted to be kind of angelic and beautiful, but I don't know, there's something about this saying that still reads creepy, evil, menacing, don't come near me, I'm a bad guy villain. And really that's kind of a nitpick, but the reason I bring him up is because when he's talking to Jesus, he's trying to tempt him into not going through with this crucifixion, a snake comes out of Satan's robes and approaches Jesus, and Jesus stomps on it with his heel. And that imagery of the serpent and the heel coming down on it is in the Bible, but it's in Genesis. It was a prophecy that someday a descendant of Adam and Eve would arrive and would crush the head of Satan, ending evil forever. But it wouldn't come without a price, because the serpent would bite the heel of this hero while his head is being crushed. And a lot of theologians have taken this as the first prophecy of Christ. And now that we have Christ in this movie and we have him in the garden, it's kind of reminiscent of the Garden of Eden. And I can see where Mel Gibson was going with this, actually showing this prophecy taking place. But there are a couple things wrong with how it's executed. For one, the snake never bites him in the heel. He just gets crushed and died. And second, the crushing of the snake is often associated with Christ's second coming, where he comes in victory as this king and he rules and he defeats evil and death. And the biting of the heel is usually referred to as the first coming, where Jesus actually pays the price. He sacrifices himself. You could say he was pierced. So again, I like where Mel Gibson was going with it. I just don't think it necessarily works on a theological level in execution. I think there were a couple missteps there. But now let's talk about the part of the movie that everybody likes to talk about, and it's the violence. Because that's another thing that really sets this movie apart from really every biblical movie. I can't think of a one that has this level of violence, of blood and guts and just disturbing imagery. And I have to give Mel Gibson credit for having the guts to really show what crucifixion and scourging would have looked like. And when this movie focuses on those elements, the suffering, the different ways Jesus suffered leading up to the crucifixion, it works. And right away you start to see Roman and Jewish soldiers just beating this guy because they just don't like him. And it does say in the Bible that Jesus was beat about the face and head, and he was already kind of swollen before he actually made it to trial. And we do see that, although I do think it goes a little overboard when one of the soldiers just throws him over this big wall and he's chained up and it just kind of whiplashes him and it hurts his back. I don't know, I feel like he probably would have been dead. That's a little bit more creative license than I kind of would have liked to see. But we do see him thrown in jail. He's brought before the Sanhedrin. He fails that trial. He's brought to Pilate. He's brought to Herod, and kind of back and forth between the two because neither one really wants to deal with this guy because they're like, well, yeah, he's kind of annoying and he's a nuisance and he might cause problems, but he hasn't really done anything yet. And it's because of this hesitation, Pilate orders Jesus to just get scourged and then we're gonna, release him and maybe he'll learn his lesson to not cause so many problems. And as a result, we get what you might consider to be the best or worst scene in the movie, and it's when Jesus gets scourged. He gets whipped with both reeds and flagellum, I think is what it's called. The modern version is the cat o' nine tails, and it's exactly what you think it is. It's all these different hooks of bone and metal that will just dig into your flesh and rip it apart. And it's this scene I think is what really elevated this to a hard R rating. I can't imagine it being rated anything else. This is incredibly hard to watch. You really do feel every whip and every beating, and yeah, it's rough, and I don't blame anybody that has turned the movie off at this point, because it really shows you the damage that the flagellum and the reeds can do to a human body, especially when they turn him over, because at first they're just beating him and whipping him across the back, but then when they turn him over, they're starting to do the front side. And if you know anything about the human body is a lot less protected in the front than it is in the back. And yeah, we see that too. And maybe this is something just wrong with me in my head. Maybe I've just seen too many movies, I've been too desensitized, but I actually think that this scene is maybe the most important biblical scene ever put to film, because there is something valuable from a religious perspective to actually see the suffering of Jesus put on film. And it gives me a greater appreciation for the suffering that Jesus went through when I can see just how bad it really was. Because let's be honest, a lot of Jesus films really toned down the graphic violence that would have been on display. Crucifixion was an incredibly gruesome and painful and just gross looking way to execute somebody. So you really can't accurately portray that in a G-rated family film. That just is not going to happen. And I know that a lot of people who make these religious films want it to be family friendly so that parents can show their kids and be like, okay, this is the story of Jesus, in order to raise them understanding Jesus and the Bible and all the morals. But do all of them have to be that way? Really? Can we not get some more adult-oriented biblical films that actually take the source material seriously and treat the audience seriously with some intelligence that, yeah, this is what somebody who was crucified would look like? This. Not this. And while I won't say this is a movie that I like to watch all the time, I like to watch this about maybe once a year, you know, around Good Friday, Easter time. I start thinking about the crucifixion of Jesus, and I'm like, oh yeah, Passion of Christ did a pretty good job at showing that. I'll pop it in, get myself in the mindset. I'm really glad that, okay, maybe not the whole movie, but definitely this scene. I'm so glad that this scene was filmed and that we have it to use as a visual reference for people when they're reading the Gospels and they're thinking, oh man, all this whipping, like, how would this work? How would this affect the human body? We can turn to the Passion of the Christ and see a pretty accurate depiction of what that would look like. And I think the world has benefited from that. But the suffering doesn't stop there. We have the crown of thorns very quickly afterwards getting jammed into his head, which I am glad that they didn't just put it lightly on his head and call it a day, that they actually kind of used reeds and jammed it into his scalp, because that's what the Bible says. But it doesn't stop there, because next we have Jesus carrying his cross all the way to Golgotha, the place of the skull. And it's here where the historical inaccuracies do start to kind of build up for me a little bit, because for one, there's no way Jesus would have been carrying this entire cross. That cross would have been easily 300 pounds. There's no way anybody would have been able or expected to carry that all that way. Most likely Jesus would have only been expected to carry the cross beam, the single beam, that would have weighed around 100 pounds, so it's still pretty heavy and pretty hard to carry. And in this movie, we do see that with the two thieves, they do carry the single cross beam, so I'm like, okay, that's right, but Jesus should be doing that too. And then there's also Simon of Cyrene, because naturally Jesus couldn't carry it all the way, because we'll just look at him. So the Romans pull up this random guy from the crowd, and they're like, okay, you have to carry it for him, do it, or we'll kill you too. And Cyrene was a city in North Africa, so most likely, historically speaking, Simon of Cyrene was most likely black, or at least, you know, pretty dark compared to what we get here. So yeah, that's a point off in the accuracy total. But what I really want to talk about is when they get to the place of the skull and Jesus is being nailed to the cross, they nail him in the palms, which I'm sure popular culture has pretty much accepted as the truth, although historically and medically speaking, that didn't happen. Most likely he would have actually been nailed in the wrist, which still, according to the scriptures, would have still counted as the hand. And we do see that in a couple depictions here and there, but really, we get so many pictures of it right in the palm. And if you imagine him getting nailed up there, there's not a whole lot keeping his hand there, and it would have just kind of slipped out and just ripped all the flesh, and well, then he's fallen off the cross. You can't have that. Romans were very efficient, so they put it in the wrist, where the bones in the hand would have actually stopped it from slipping and sliding. So yeah, that's another point off, and it really does kind of bother me, because this movie still, by and large, is the most accurate depiction of Jesus' suffering and his crucifixion that we've ever gotten. But there's all these little details of historical inaccuracies and just reliance on kind of Catholic imagery that kind of hurts this movie for me in a way, because the movie prides itself on being realistic, and in these moments it just isn't. But from here to Jesus' death, it's all played pretty much straight. You get Jesus on the cross, and I do appreciate that as the cross was getting raised up, it falls into the hole, and there's a visible jerk that happens to Jesus because, yeah, the momentum, it would have kind of just pulled on everything, and that's just even more pain and suffering than we usually think about. And that is a testament to this movie as a whole, that even though it might not be historically accurate in all these little details, there are still quite a few details added logistically that do add to the pain and suffering of Jesus that would have existed historically, just thinking, common sense, but aren't specifically spelled out in the Bible. And I even think they did a good job with the two thieves, one on each side of him. One of them kind of mocking him and the other one actually believing in him, and he says that you're going to be with me in paradise. That's all fine until he gets taken down from the cross and he's held in Mary's arm. And as an emotional moment and as a moment to just kind of reflect on everything that this poor guy has gone through, and now he's at peace, and Mary, who's watched all this happen and has suffered right along with Jesus, as any mother would, she can look at him and see him at peace and, start the proper grieving process. And on top of that, it beautifully recreates Michelangelo's sculpture, the Pieta. So on all those levels, it works and it's effective, except most likely that scene would not have happened. That's because in the Jewish community, it was very taboo to touch anything dead, even your own son. So Mary, being a devout Jewish woman, most likely would not have actually touched the dead body of Jesus. She would have probably still been there when he was taken down, but that scene of her holding him just most likely wouldn't have happened. It's actually more likely that the Romans took him down, and then Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus would have oversaw the wrapping, so they can do that before the Sabbath starts, so they have enough time to get, ritually clean from that. But Mary holding him probably didn't happen. And then the movie ends with Jesus getting sealed up in his tomb, and then there's this interesting kind of continuous shot where you assume the passage of time's happening, and you see the stone rolled away, you see the dead body kind of dissolve, and you see a new alive Jesus, and he stands up and you see the hole in his hand, and boom, that's the end of the movie. That's all you get for Easter, just the one shot of Jesus walking out of the tomb. Maybe he's saving that for the sequel. And that's pretty much the Passion of Christ from beginning to end, except there are two big elements of this movie that I left out. First of which is the flashbacks, because even though this movie only spans the time frame that I just talked about, we do get different flashbacks here and there. We do get a couple flashbacks with Mary and a younger Jesus before all this suffering happened, and it is kind of cute to see Jesus as this playful, likable guy, because a lot of Jesus portrayals have just kind of had him as this stoic, ethereal guy that doesn't really interact with people. So it is nice to see him interact with his mom the way a son would interact with his mom. But we also get a flashback from Mary Magdalene, played by Monica Bellucci, and she does a great job. She's fine. She's actually kind of the only actress that I recognize in this movie. A lot of these actors are kind of lower tier, not that big of a name, which actually helps the immersion because you don't just see celebrities in these roles, you just see the characters they're playing. And while Mary Magdalene is fine in the main story, in the flashback she gets, we see that she was the woman that the Pharisees caught in the act of adultery, that everybody was going to try to stone, and then Jesus started writing in the dirt, and they all kind of dropped their stones. And it really kind of bothers me how often Mary Magdalene is put as that woman in that scene across film adaptations. There's so many Jesus film adaptations that choose to have Mary Magdalene as that woman, where that is not made clear at all in the Bible. We really don't know who that woman was, but it's pretty clear that it probably wasn't Mary Magdalene, because by that time Mary Magdalene was kind of already part of the ministry. She already knew Jesus, and the only backstory we get with Mary Magdalene is the fact that she was troubled with demons, 7 of them, and the idea that she was a prostitute or a woman of ill repute or an adulteress has very little, if any, biblical grounds. But even so, in popular culture, it's really hard to get away from that when that's what everyone associates her with. So again, I just kind of wish that Mel Gibson did a little more research and not just giving people what pop culture showed as who these people are and how it was portrayed. It's kind of the same thing with the hands and the palms. It's a pop culture thing. I get it. I know that nobody's really going to question it. But again, it's not technically biblically accurate. So I just thought I'd address it here. But there was another thing I wanted to talk about before I wrap up, and that is the slow-mo in this movie. And the slow-mo is pretty intense, and it's used a lot. Sometimes it's very effective. Other times, it's a little self-indulgent. I'm pretty sure if you were to cut all the flashbacks and you were to speed up the slow-mo to just regular film speed, this movie would only be like 30 minutes. That is how much slow-mo is in this movie. And yeah, sometimes it works, sometimes it looks really cool, but I feel like a little bit more restraint would have made us feel more like we're actually there witnessing it and not like, oh, this is a movie made by a director who's trying to get us to really pay attention to everything going on. And those are pretty much my thoughts on Passion of the Christ. I could go into a lot more detail and pick apart every historical and biblical inaccuracy that's in this movie, because there are a handful, but by and large, this movie does right by the crucifixion of Jesus. Even though I have my issues on its kind of reliance on pop culture imagery over biblical accuracy, I really do appreciate what Mel Gibson achieved with this movie, and that is to show to everybody what happened to Jesus from the time he got arrested to when he died on the cross. I'd say he succeeded in that, to the shock and horror of everybody, even though Mel Gibson didn't even include everything that happened to Jesus. He didn't include his beard getting ripped out. He didn't include the fact that he was most likely naked on the cross. I mean, that's kind of debatable. Personally, I think it would have been more likely that he was stripped completely naked on the cross, and we don't see that here. But I think Mel Gibson realized that the amount that he showed was enough. It was enough to really get people thinking and visualizing the crucifixion of Christ in a different way, in a much more messy and brutal way than a lot of people probably assumed before 2004. So I don't fault him for that. But now I turn over to you guys. What do you think about the Passion of Christ? Have you seen it? What do you think about it? Is it a movie that you watch every year? Is it a movie that you've only watched once? Is it a movie that you can't stand to watch because it's just so brutal and difficult? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments, and if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby, this is my nerdy talk, and I'll see you in the next video.